Officer and his canine saw three puppies hanging for sale at one. What happened next will break your heart. The late autumn sun had barely climbed over the ridges of Maple Ridge, Colorado, when Officer Nate Walker guided his patrol car down Main Street. The town looked deceptively peaceful. Red leaves fluttered against the crisp morning air, and shopkeepers raised their shutters one by one. But years on the force had taught Nate that quiet streets could hide dark corners. In the passenger seat sat Rex, his partner of nearly a decade. Once the pride of the K9 unit, the 10-year-old German Shepherd now bore a limp from a bullet wound earned in a warehouse ambush. Though retired, his amber eyes still flicked with the sharpness of a soldier who never forgot the smell of danger. As they rolled past an old brick building that once served as a veterinary clinic, Rex stiffened, his ears pricked, nostrils flared, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Nate tapped the brakes, frowning. "What is it, boy?" Through the grime-smeared windows of the abandoned clinic, Nate glimpsed something that froze him. A cage, rusted and dangling by a hook, normally used for butchered meat, swung gently in the draft. Inside were three tiny bodies, puppies, their ribs showing, their eyes glazed with fear. A warped cardboard sign leaned against the wall. 3 for $1, must go today. For a heartbeat, Nate couldn't breathe. The cruelty of it hit him like a punch. He'd seen violent gangs, armed robberies, overdoses, but nothing twisted his gut quite like this senseless display of life treated as disposable. Rex barked once, sharp and insistent, as though demanding action. Nate shoved open the door, his boots echoing on the cracked pavement. The stench of urine and stale blood wafted as he stepped inside. The puppies whimpered, pressed together in the corner of the cage, their tiny tails tucked under. One was mottled brown with trembling paws, another black-coated with ears too large for its head, the third pale and frail, barely moving. His hand shook as he reached for his wallet. "You're coming with me," he muttered, voice breaking. He slid a single crumpled dollar under the cage door, more ritual than transaction, and lifted the entire cage into his arms. Rex circled close, his growl softening to a protective whine. On the sidewalk outside, the morning light caught the three fragile faces pressed against the bars. Nate looked down at them and whispered, "You're safe now." What he did not yet know was that saving them would unravel a trail of cruelty far larger than a single cage, and that Rex, scarred but unbroken, would soon lead him into a battle neither of them could ignore. Maple Ridge was the kind of mountain town that lived in two worlds at once. By day, it looked postcard perfect, tidy storefronts with painted shutters, the scent of pine drifting from the hills, and the steady hum of pickup trucks rolling down Main Street. But beneath that charm ran currents of hardship and secrets. Old mills stood rusting at the edge of town, reminders of a factory that had closed decades earlier, leaving families scraping by. Some turned to honest work, others to shadows. Nate Walker knew both sides. At 38, he wore the uniform not just as duty, but as armor. Years ago, he had served as an Army MP, where he learned discipline and the cost of loyalty. After coming home, he had lost his wife in a car accident, a single shattering night that left him raising his young daughter Emily alone. Emily was now 13, with her mother's sharp wit and her father's quiet resilience. She was the reason Nate carried on, the reason he poured himself into policing the streets of Maple Ridge when so many had given up. At home, their family was larger than just two. Rex, The German Shepherd with a graying muzzle was the heartbeat of the house. Nate had trained him from a pup, turning him into one of the most skilled K-9 officers in the region. Together, they had dismantled drug rings, located missing children, and tracked armed fugitives. But 3 years earlier, everything changed. In a sting gone wrong, Rex had been hit in the leg by a shotgun blast. He had survived, but the injury ended his service. Since then, Rex had shifted roles, from officer to guardian, from warrior to teacher of gentler lessons. Emily often whispered into his fur at night, saying he was her best friend, her shield against nightmares. Back at the old clinic, Nate stood with the cage in his arms, Rex pacing protectively at his side. The puppies whimpered softly, their tiny bodies pressed together for warmth. He lowered the cage into the back of his cruiser, then drove straight to the only person he trusted with something this fragile: Dr. Mara Jensen. Mara's clinic sat on the edge of town, a warm place smelling faintly of antiseptic and hay. A red-haired woman in her 40s, she had once dreamed of running a research lab, but had returned to Maple Ridge to care for her ailing mother. She treated every animal that came through her door like family, often refusing payment from struggling farmers. When Nate carried the cage inside, her face paled. "Oh, Nate." Her voice trembled as she bent to inspect the puppies. She gently lifted the black-coated one first, checking its gums, its heartbeat. Then the mottled brown one. Finally, the pale, frail pup whose chest rose and fell with effort. "They're alive, but weak, malnourished, and—" She paused, holding up a tiny paw where faint puncture marks scarred the skin. "Someone's been injecting them with something." Rex growled low in his throat, pacing the exam room, sensing the tension. Nate crouched beside him, rubbing his shoulder. "Easy, boy. We'll figure this out." Mara fetched a small evidence bag from her cabinet. Inside it, she placed a dirty syringe she had found wedged into the puppy's bedding. She shook her head grimly. Steroids, growth hormones. Whoever had these pups wasn't trying to sell pets. They were manufacturing something. "Look." She showed Nate the smallest puppy's trembling legs. "Her bones can't support the rapid growth the drugs are forcing. Without treatment, she won't survive long." The words hit Nate like a blow. He had seen cruelty before, toward people, toward animals, but each time it stung like the first. He stroked the puppy's tiny head, his jaw tight. "Not this time, not these three." Mara glanced at him, worry in her eyes. "Nate, if this is connected to the rumors I've heard, the underground breeders, the auctions, you'll be walking straight into a storm." "They're dangerous." Nate gave a faint, tired smile. "Storms don't scare me anymore." He looked down at Rex, who sat with steady eyes fixed on the pups. "Besides, I've got backup." For Emily, the arrival of the puppies that evening was both heartbreak and joy. She crouched on the kitchen floor, whispering to them as she offered tiny bowls of soft food Mara had prepared. "You're Ember," she told the mottled brown one, "because you're still burning bright inside, even if you're small." She tapped the sturdy black pup next. "You're Bruno, strong and brave." Her eyes softened as she lifted the weakest of the three, a pale puppy whose ribs showed with every breath. "And you're Piper. You need the most love." Nate stood in the doorway, watching his daughter cradle Piper against her chest while Rex hovered, sniffing each pup, then lying down with a protective sigh. The sight stirred something in Nate's chest, a mixture of sorrow for the cruelty the pups had endured and gratitude that fate, or perhaps Rex's instincts, had led them to that clinic window. In that quiet kitchen, under the soft glow of a single lamp, a promise was made, unspoken yet clear. These puppies would not be discarded. They would be family. The next morning, Maple Ridge woke beneath a soft quilt of fog. Dew clung to the grass, and the air smelled of pine needles and wet earth. Inside the Walker home, the kitchen was alive with sounds that hadn't been heard in years. Tiny paws tapping against linoleum, squeaks of play, the muffled thud of Rex's tail against the floor as he supervised with grave patience. Emily sat cross-legged on the rug, her hair a wild tangle from sleep, holding a bottle of puppy formula. Piper, the weakest of the three, suckled greedily, her small body pressed against Emily's arm. Bruno wrestled clumsily with a stuffed toy, his paws too big for his frame, while Ember toddled toward Rex, trying to clamber over his massive paws. Rex, dignified and graying, lowered his head to meet the pup's curious gaze. For a moment, man and beast alike watched. Then Rex gave a slow lick across Ember's forehead, sealing something invisible, something older than words. Ember yipped in delight and curled beside him as though she had always belonged there. Nate leaned in the doorway, a mug of coffee warming his scarred hands. He should have felt tired. He had spent half the night building a makeshift pen in the mudroom, but instead he felt an energy he hadn't known in years. Watching Emily laugh, watching Rex soften for the pups, was like sunlight after a long winter. Later that day, Nate carried the cage back to Mara Jensen's clinic for a follow-up check. The small exam room smelled of antiseptic and hay, the metal table cool beneath the puppy's paws. Mara's eyes softened as she watched Piper cling stubbornly to Nate's shirt pocket. "She's fighting harder than I thought she would," Mara murmured, listening to the puppy's faint heartbeat. "She wants to live." Nate rubbed Piper's ears gently. "Then we'll give her that chance." It was more than a promise. It was a vow, the kind a soldier once made to his brothers in uniform, the kind a father made to his daughter. And now it was the kind he made to three creatures who had been tossed aside for profit. That evening, Emily brought out a notebook from her school bag and wrote the names of the puppies in neat block letters. Ember, Bruno, Piper. Underneath, she drew a heart. Rex lay beside her, his head resting on her knee, watching as if approving the ceremony. "You know, Dad," Emily said softly, "they'll need training. You could teach them, like you taught Rex." Nate chuckled, kneeling beside her. "It'll take time and patience. Then we'll have both." Emily looked up, her eyes shining with a mix of determination and hope. "We can make them strong again." In that moment, the kitchen no longer felt like a place of grief and empty spaces. It felt alive, brimming with possibility. Days turned into weeks. The bond grew in countless small ways, Ember barking at the vacuum cleaner until Rex nudged her aside with weary tolerance. Bruno sitting proudly when Emily held out a treat, mimicking Rex's old training. Piper learning to climb the porch steps, each wobbly attempt cheered on by Emily's laughter. For Nate, the bond was forged in quieter moments. The way Rex always positioned himself between the pups and the door, protective even in sleep. The way Emily's laughter softened the ache that had lingered in the house since her mother's death. And the way the three fragile lives seemed to mirror his own, scarred but not broken. He began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, second chances weren't a myth. They were alive, breathing, curled in a pile of fur at the foot of his daughter's bed. Night fell early in Maple Ridge that winter, shadows pooling across the streets before dinner was finished. Nate sat alone on the porch, the cold pine-scented wind tugging at his jacket. Rex lay at his feet, the pups asleep inside, their tiny snores muffled through the door. Nate's gaze wandered toward the darkened horizon, but his mind was elsewhere, back in the desert, under a sky scorched by sun and fractured by gunfire. He could still hear the ambush. The convoy had been quiet, too quiet. Then came the explosion, a concussive roar that flung men into the dust. He remembered Rex, young, sharp, and unyielding then, lunging to drag a wounded private to cover, refusing to leave him behind. Nate had crawled beside them, his ears ringing, the taste of metal and sand on his tongue. They had survived, but half the unit had not. And Rex, though alive, carried scars invisible to most, a limp on rainy days, a twitch in his sleep, a growl at sudden noises. It was after that ambush Nate made the decision to retire Rex. Some men had called it mercy. Nate called it guilt. He hadn't wanted Rex to shoulder the weight of any more battles. And yet, sitting on the porch now, he wondered if bringing Rex home to an empty house hadn't been its own kind of cruelty. Inside, Emily stirred in her sleep, murmuring something he couldn't catch. Her laughter during the day masked her loneliness, just as his work masked his grief. They had lost his wife, her mother, 2 winters ago, to a sudden illness. The house had grown cold then, no matter how high the furnace roared. Nate buried himself in patrols, in paperwork, in anything that wasn't the silence of his living room. Emily, quiet and resilient, had tried to fill the void with school and friends, but the nights were hardest. Only Rex seemed to understand. Now, with 3 fragile lives in their care, the silence was finally breaking. But even as hope stirred, the shadows of the past pressed close. At the clinic a week later, Mara Jensen handed Nate a folder. "You should see this," she said grimly. Inside were medical notes she had pieced together from the strange syringes and the coded slip, AXT 448K9. "It isn't just steroids," she explained. "It's a prototype compound, synthetic enhancers. Someone's been experimenting on these pups." Nate felt the air drain from the room. Experimenting for what? "Most likely aggression," Mara said. "Street fights, guard training. Black market dogs fetch thousands if they can be made more violent." Her words landed like blows. He looked at the pups playing clumsily in the corner, so innocent, their bellies still round from formula. He pictured their lives had Rex not stopped at that clinic window. Cages, commands barked in cruel tones, a future of pain and blood. His fists clenched. Not these 3, never again. Later that night, Emily found him staring at the folder. She slid into the chair beside him, resting her head on his arm. "Dad," she whispered, "why are people so mean to dogs?" Nate swallowed hard. How could he explain the rot he had seen? Men who turned loyalty into a weapon, who saw life only in terms of profit. He couldn't. So he told her the only truth he knew. "Because they've forgotten what love is, but we haven't. And that's why we're going to keep them safe." Emily nodded, satisfied, but the question lingered in Nate's chest long after she had gone to bed. 2 nights later, Rex startled awake, his hackles rising. Nate followed his gaze to the mudroom window. For a moment, he thought it was just a shadow. But then he saw it, the faint reflection of a man watching from the tree line. By the time he reached the yard, the figure was gone, but footprints in the snow told him enough. Someone was looking for the puppies. He returned inside, locking the doors, the old soldier in him alive again. Whoever had left those pups hanging in a cage for $1 had not given them up willingly. They had been merchandise, stolen now in the eyes of men who trafficked lives. Nate knew then that saving the puppies had not been the end of the story. It was the beginning of a battle. The first snowstorm of December swept across Maple Ridge, frosting rooftops and swallowing sound. Nate drove his cruiser slowly through the swirling white, Rex at his side, the 3 puppies bundled in blankets at home with Emily. His chest tightened with unease. Ever since spotting those footprints outside the yard, he had felt eyes on him. The traffickers had not forgotten. That evening, a knock rattled the front door. Emily peeked through the curtain and saw a woman standing there. Dark coat, scarf pulled high. Nate's instincts bristled. He opened the door only halfway. "Officer Walker?" the woman asked softly. "I think I know something about those pups you rescued." Her name was Chloe Navarro, a federal agent with the Task Force on Animal Trafficking. She had been tracking Lyle Darnell for months, the same man Nate had identified from the clinic footage. "He runs auctions in abandoned warehouses," Chloe explained, sliding photos across the table. Cages, chains, terrified eyes staring out from shadows. "We believe those 3 were rejects, too small, too weak for the buyers. He tried to unload them fast before cutting his losses." Nate's jaw tightened. "Rejects," he muttered, the word tasting like poison. Ember, Bruno, and Piper were curled against Emily's legs in the next room, alive and playful, and yet to Darnell they were trash. Chloe leaned in. "We're moving on him soon, but Darnell knows who you are. He's been asking questions. You need to be ready." 2 nights later, readiness was no longer a choice. It was nearly midnight when Rex erupted in a low growl, his nose pointed at the back door. Nate grabbed his pistol and motioned Emily upstairs. Through the glass he saw movement, 3 men creeping along the fence line. Flashlights dimmed. One carried a sack large enough to hold more than just tools. The intruders forced the gate, but Rex was faster. With a bark that shattered the stillness, he lunged into the yard. The men scattered, cursing, but one raised a pipe. Nate's warning shout came too late. The man swung hard. Rex dodged, teeth flashing, and clamped down on the attacker's arm. The other 2 rushed forward, and suddenly Nate was in the snow, grappling, the world a blur of fists and boots. A shot split the night, not Nate's. The bullet whined into the siding of the house. He rolled, disarmed one man with a practiced twist, and slammed him into the ground. Rex tore the pipe from another's grip, his growls vibrating like thunder. Then headlights flared. A black SUV barreled down the street, stopping just short of the fence. The men broke free and bolted toward it. Darnell himself leaned out the window, his scarred face illuminated by the dashboard glow. His eyes locked with Nate's, cold, calculating, and full of promise. "We'll take back what's ours," Darnell shouted before the SUV sped away into the night. Emily sobbed from the porch, the puppies yelping in fright. Nate gathered them all inside, his heart hammering. He checked Rex, who limped slightly but wagged his tail, eyes fierce with loyalty. Chloe arrived minutes later with backup, sirens slicing the night air. She surveyed the scene, jaw tight. That was Darnell himself. He doesn't usually get his hands dirty. He's desperate. Nate cradled Piper, the smallest pup trembling in his arms. Desperate men do stupid things. Next time, he won't just come for the dogs. He'll come for us. Chloe's gaze hardened. Then we bring the fight to him. Tomorrow night, auction house, East Side warehouse. We'll end this. For the first time since Afghanistan, Nate felt the old weight of combat press on his shoulders. But this time, he wasn't fighting for soldiers in desert sands. He was fighting for 3 tiny lives asleep in his daughter's lap, and for the old war dog who had never left his side. The storm outside howled against the windows, a warning and a promise. Tomorrow would be the reckoning. The abandoned warehouse on the east side of Maple Ridge loomed like a skeleton against the night sky. Broken windows gaped like empty eyes, and the wind whistled through rusted beams. Nate crouched behind a stack of crates with Rex pressed against his knee, the dog's ears pricked and body taut as wire. Across the lot, Agent Chloe Navarro and her team of federal officers moved silently into position. Inside, the auction was already in full swing. Harsh floodlights illuminated rows of cages. Dozens of dogs, German shepherds, pit bulls, even golden retrievers, whimpered and clawed at the bars. A crowd of men in leather jackets and suits circled the stage where a handler dragged out a trembling pup, forcing it to respond to shouted commands. The room echoed with cruel laughter and the clink of money-changing hands. And then Nate saw them. Ember, Bruno, and Piper, his 3 rescues, stuffed together in a cage near the back. Ember barked hoarsely, Bruno pressed against the bars, and tiny Piper whimpered, nose bloody from some rough handling. Nate's chest tightened. Darnell stood at the center, a cigar glowing between his fingers, grinning like a butcher surveying carcasses. "These ain't pets," he barked. "These are weapons. Bid high, gentlemen. Tonight, we breed champions." Chloe's voice crackled softly in Nate's earpiece. "On my mark." But Nate never heard the count. A handler raised a whip over Bruno's cage, and Nate moved. He burst through the door, weapon drawn, Rex exploding at his side with a roar that silenced the room. "Police! Get away from the dogs!" Nate's shout cracked through the chaos. Panic erupted. Some men bolted for the exits, others pulled knives, even guns. Rex launched at the whip handler, knocking him flat. Nate fired into the ceiling, forcing the room to freeze for a heartbeat, long enough for Chloe's team to storm in, shouting commands, weapons trained. Darnell snarled, grabbing Piper's cage and dragging it toward the back. "This one's pure stock," he roared. "Over my dead body." Nate sprinted, Rex close behind. The old dog was slower now, his injured hip straining, but his eyes burned with determination. They cornered Darnell near the loading bay. He pulled a pistol, jamming it against the cage. Piper yelped. "Drop it," Nate barked, weapon steady. Darnell sneered. "Shoot me and you kill the pup. Back off." For a frozen second, the world narrowed to the trembling puppy, the trembling trigger finger, and the rasp of Rex's breath beside Nate. Then Rex made the choice. With a sudden surge, the old shepherd lunged, not at Darnell's throat, but at his wrist. The pistol clattered to the floor. Darnell swung wildly, kicking hard. Rex yelped but held on, his teeth locked. Nate rushed forward, tackling Darnell, fists flying until cuffs snapped shut around the man's wrists. Silence fell, broken only by the whimpers of freed dogs and Rex's labored panting. Nate dropped to his knees beside his partner. Blood matted Rex's fur where the kick had landed, his flank rising and falling in uneven rhythm. "You did it, boy," Nate whispered, stroking the scarred head. "You saved them all." Chloe rushed over, lifting Piper from the cage. The tiny pup wriggled free and crawled straight onto Rex's chest, licking his muzzle with frantic devotion. Ember and Bruno barked nearby, tails wagging, their cries echoing like a victory chorus. The raid ended with dozens of arrests, 12 dogs rescued, and Darnell finally in chains. But in Nate's heart, the night was defined by one image: Rex, battered and weary, lying surrounded by the very lives he had protected. And though Nate feared the old shepherd's strength might not last the night, Rex's eyes shone clear, fierce, and proud. He had done what he was born to do: protect, defend, and give everything for the innocent. Dawn broke over Maple Ridge with a gentleness the town had not felt in years. The warehouse raid dominated headlines, hailed as a decisive victory against the black market trade. But for Nate Walker, the true victory was quieter, measured not in arrests or reports, but in the soft weight of 3 puppies asleep at his feet and the steady breathing of an old dog who had once more proven his courage. Rex recovered slowly from his injuries, his hip more fragile, his muzzle more silver than ever. Yet every time Nate worried that his partner's strength was failing, Rex would rise when the puppies stirred, guiding them with patient nudges, teaching them to heel, to sit, to trust. Ember grew bold, Bruno strong, and little Piper, once the weakest, developed a spark of fearless energy, as though Rex had gifted her a part of his own spirit. Weeks passed. The town gathered to honor Rex with a ceremony on the courthouse steps. Children held handmade signs. "Thank you, Rex," scrawled in bright crayon. The mayor pinned a medal to Nate's uniform, but it was the old shepherd who received the loudest cheers. Rex stood tall despite his limp, the 3 puppies flanking him like a living testament to his legacy. Nate declined a promotion that would have pulled him from Maple Ridge. "My place is here," he told Chloe Navarro when she asked why. He looked at Rex, at Ember, Bruno, and Piper tumbling in the grass. "They need me, and truth is, I need them too." Months later, Ember, Bruno, and Piper were accepted into the state's K-9 Academy. They weren't just rescues anymore, they were recruits, carrying forward the work Rex had embodied. On graduation day, Rex sat proudly in the front row, his tail thumping against the ground as his protégés trotted past in their new vests. That night, Nate built a wooden sign and hung it on the front gate of his home. The words, carved carefully and painted deep brown, read, "Here, you're not for sale." It was more than a promise to the dogs in his care, it was a vow to every soul that crossed his threshold. As the sun set, Nate sat on the porch steps, Rex leaning against his leg. The puppies chased fireflies in the yard, their barks ringing like laughter. Nate whispered, "You've given them a future, old friend." Rex tilted his head, amber eyes reflecting the last light of day. His paws bore scars, his body bore age, but his spirit burned undimmed. And in that quiet moment, Nate knew. Not all heroes wore uniforms, and not all left medals behind. Some left paw prints etched forever into the hearts they saved.